So now that we added this header component here, I'd say the next step that makes sense to build this investment calculator app here is to add a component that handles the user input, because we'll need this input to calculate the investment result data, so the data we need for this table, which you want to show on the screen. And therefore, I'll add another new component, because of course, as you already learned in the previous sections, the goal with React is to split your app into such components where every component has its own responsibility. And I'd say getting that user input is a separate feature of the app that should go into a separate component, and that's why I will add a separate component here. The user input component, we could say. And this is a component that will be responsible for fetching the different pieces of user input we need, the initial investment amount, and so on. And therefore in here, we'll export another component function. And in this component function here, I want to return a section, let's say, or we could also return a form, but we'll explore working with form elements and dive a bit deeper into handling user input with React later in the course in a separate section. Therefore, for now, I'll just go for a section here. And I'll give this section an ID of user input, because that's another ID you can find in the index.css file. In there, you'll find CSS rules that are looking for an element with an ID user input on it. And that's why I'm adding this here to this section. And then in here, in this section, I wanna output various input fields. And to structure those input fields and to make them look good, I'll add a div here with a CSS class added with the class name prop, as you learned, input group on it, which is also something you'll find in the index.css file. There you'll find this rule looking for such an input group CSS class. And I'm adding it here on this div so that inside of that div we can add a paragraph which will then hold a label and an input element inside of it. And my idea is simply to have multiple such label input combinations inside of an input group, and this input group CSS class will simply make sure that these different paragraphs are showing up next to each other in the same row. But now here the idea for those input elements is to ask the user for the initial investment, so the amount that's initially invested, and to ask the user for the annual investment. So how much money the user wants to invest every year after the initial investment. And then I want to have a second input group below the first group where we also ask for the expected return. So that expected rate of return which the user expects to earn every year. And then last but not least, the duration of the investment. So how long the user plans to hold that investment until the money is needed. These are the 4 input fields I want to have here, the 4 label input combinations. And for every label, we have an input where we expect to get a number as an input. So I'll set the input type here to number, which simply influences how the input field is displayed to the user and how it works. And I'll therefore do that for all these input fields because all these values are numbers in the end. And in addition, I'll also add the required prop to all these input fields, which will simply make sure that a value must be entered. And we could also write required equals true, but just adding the prop like this is a bit shorter and will achieve the same result. And now we of course need to add some logic to get hold of that value that's entered by the user. and to reflect that value back into that input field. So we need that two-way binding I showed you earlier in this course.